they would.
Yeah, we go for it.
And then, one of the other.
By the way,
Dirt. So he came walking out of his office.
what is over there?
Walking up.
Good. I did real good. Good morning.
You feeling better?
Oh, yeah, I'm doing better.
Morning. How you doing? Morning.
My only way to lose. Always. Winning flag. Okay, I'm good from now on. I wouldn't have to watch it. I'll leave it like that. I read it afterwards, and I went, oh yeah, we're good. I think. Hold on, we're good. Don't trigger. We're good.
Good morning. It is good to see everyone today. Glad that we can once again be assembled here together this fine Lord's Day for class. We certainly appreciate your attendance here, and if you're with us online, we are thankful that you have joined us also. We're going to sing number 25, the first and fourth verses, Anywhere with Jesus. I think Ernie passed on to me his coughing, so we'll just, I know I've heard a few others this morning too. It's got to be something to do with this weather. What he said, what? All right, anywhere with Jesus. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I can go to sleep. When the darkening shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall waken nevermore to roam. Anywhere with Jesus will be home, sweet home. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. You may go to your classes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to have everybody with us this morning. It's the first day of the week. We're going to continue our study in the book of James. James chapter 1. We've gotten through the introduction, and we are now into, of course, the first chapter. We barely got into the first chapter as we continue to look at this area here. Let me just make sure I'm in the right spot. Yes, I am. All right. So as we look at this, we've talked about how what the book of James is about. And as you notice, we've said that it's basically how to understand spiritual maturity. And maturity is important. We all understand that. We're all mature in different things, I'm sure. And but when it comes to our spiritual life, our Christian life, we definitely have to have that spiritual maturity. And it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't, it's not something really that you learn, it's something that we get from God. And it's, we get it through prayer. We hear that all the time, that the way to get wisdom is through prayer. But the question is, will God always give us that wisdom? You know, or will, he talks about giving it liberally, but will we actually receive it? Is there something else we have to do to get to that point, to get that wisdom? And there is. And we'll talk about that as we continue through this area. So, as we've been looking at this, we said that what it's all about. Well, we know that James chapter 1, verse 4 kind of sums it up for us. And it says, "And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." The word perfect there means maturity, when we see that. And so that's the understanding where we're at with that. So we got to chapter 1, and we started into it, chapter 1, verse 1 through 8, talking about how to turn trials into triumphs. And we know when it comes to trials, we discussed this, that we all have trials. We all face trials. And trials are different from tribulation. You know, we need to understand that in tribulation, you might as well say anything's bad. I mean, really bad. And where trials don't, you know, they're not always bad. And we need to realize that they, most of them actually we can grow from and learn from. And even though they may feel bad at times on us, they may be very heavy on us, which is a good thing to understand, because when you look at the definition of the word, you see that in a minute, that it's part of life, and it's something we have to do to basically get through this life, or to even be better as a Christian. So we talked about that the key to turning trials into triumph is to obey 4 imperatives that we find in the Bible, and they're just one-word imperatives, and we'll see, because each verse really deals with this. First one was to count, James 1:2. We discussed that last week. Second one is that of to know, James chapter 1, verse 3. And the third one is that to let, James chapter 1, verse 4. And then finally, James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8, is to act. So as we looked at each one of these verses, we started with verse 1, and we know that it says there to count all joy when you fall into various trials. Verse 1, chapter 1, verse 2, and we discussed it. And we noticed that James, as we went through that, assumes that we'll experience trials. He doesn't say you might. He doesn't say if it ever happens. He assumes that it's going to happen, that it's going to actually be a true thing that takes place. So we got to that point where we asked the question, well, before we get to that question, I guess we asked, you know, what is to be the Christian's response? And we said it was to count it all what? Count it all joy. And that's kind of a hard thing to do, isn't it, when you even hear the word trials? You hear the word trials, you're like, count it joy, come on. And so we discussed that a little bit last week, and we talked about it, and we left off on Philippians chapter 2, but I want to go and read the other 2 verses before that to kind of see once again what was the attitude of the apostles. And we see here beginning in Acts chapter 5, verse 41, if someone would please read that for us.
So they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name.
Thank you. Now, if you recognize that, you know, in our Acts class on Wednesday nights, we're actually in, you know, we're getting ready to get to chapter 4, and 4 is going to kind of deal with this, and 5 is the same thing, and knowing that, you know, they were dealing with some trials. They really were, Peter and John, and they were knowing how to deal with it. And so he said it very clear. He said, you know, we rejoiced at it. We rejoiced that we were under this trial from the Jews. And we counted worthy, to basically share the name of Jesus and, share in the shame that was found in his name. Because remember, the Jewish people didn't look at Jesus' name as a good thing. They looked at it as a shameful thing. They looked at him as one that was going against God, going against what they would want. And so, even though the apostles knew that wasn't the case, and there were Jews, there weren't many, but there were Jews that were starting to figure that out. When we hear the numbers 3,000, 4,000, we think, wow, that's a lot. And it really is, but not when you take in the percentage of what was there with the Jews, especially when they were all there on the day of Pentecost, when they come in from all different areas of the Mediterranean world. And so we see. But this is how they rejoiced about it, this trial that was there. Which brings us to our next one that we read last week, and we'll get our third. Romans 5:3, if someone go ahead and read that for us, please.
And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance.
Thank you. So now they go a step further. It's not only trials, but also tribulations. And tribulations, we said, is a very difficult thing. But once again, we see here the way tribulation is being talked about, the way Paul is using it. He says it'll actually cause us to grow. It'll cause us to grow in perseverance. And, when you persevere something, you're able to stand up against it. You're able to get through it. You're able to move forward from it to something else. And that's what we find, which brings us now to this one that we left off last week. Philippians chapter 2, verses 17 through 18. Paul writing this to Philippi, the Philippians. If you go ahead and read that for us, please.
Yes, and if I am being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me.
Thank you. So here Paul, once again, it says, these things are happening, these trials I'm going through, I rejoice at it. And, usually when you hear someone's going through trials, how do you feel about that for them? You feel happy? It's like someone says, you know what I'm dealing with today? And you go, whoa, that's awesome. That's just great. And they go, you are weird. I need to go find somebody else. I mean, you think about that. But here he says, you need to rejoice with me in this, because Paul understood that he was not only himself going to grow from this, but it was going to give him the opportunity to talk to more people about Jesus, and as he went through it. And it also made him realize how important his Christianity needed to be while he was here on earth. Now go ahead.
This just hit me, and I'm going to put it out there and see what you say. Now, this trials and tribulation, is it just always focused on when you are teaching about Christ or standing up for Christ, or do you think this includes all of life?
I think it includes everything. The reason I say that is because our spiritual life is supposed to be dominating over our physical life, of course. But we know that there are things in our physical life that can draw our spiritual life down, but could also bring it up. And we need to realize that they do mesh together. And when we think about it that way, we need to live a worldly life in a Christian way, in a way that God would have us, the way Christ would have us. And Paul here, remember, Paul wasn't only dealing with the Jews. He was also dealing with other things that were going on around him. He did have some difficulty, he said, with the way he looked and different things about it. That was his physical appearance. And he also had some difficulties with work, jobs. He had to find a job because the church, he said, I don't want church to help me here because I'm afraid you'll hold it against me. And so you do have your physical and spiritual. I believe we can't have one without the other. Now, as a worldly sense, when you're not a Christian, people don't look at it that way. They look at just the world. And they look at, why am I, I'm going through this, what's happening? And when we go through trials and tribulations, we say, well, that's just because we're humans. It's not only what it is. Sometimes that happens, but other times it is also because of how we're living our life as a Christian. And we'll see that. So we see that happening going forward. Brother Clifford.
It rains on the just as well as the unjust.
That's exactly right.
A Christian is going to have tribulation, and the people who's not a Christian is going to have tribulation as well.
Yep. And God, and as God, as we look at providence, God provides for everybody in the entire world, everybody in the entire world. But then there is a difference when He also provides for Christians. We see that. And so, and I understand what you're getting at is we can't, I really believe we can't have one without the other, especially when we learn to be walking in that Christian life. Paul talks about walking circumspectly, and that means completely everything included in it of what we're doing in our life. And so our Christian life should, involve our jobs, and what I mean by that is people should be able to tell the difference from other people in the job, that we're a Christian person. Our everyday life outside, our people our games, I guess you'd say, like recreation, whatever it may be, different things, all that should take into everything. And when that happens, of course, trials, I believe, as a Christian, are going to affect our physical life. They are going to affect our way of living. But we learn to get through it. We learn to deal with that weight, as the Bible's going to talk about. It's going to talk about the definition of it in a minute, and just continue in it. So that's what you got. Go ahead.
I'm going to say, to me, right at this moment, a very good example is David and Nikki.
With their house.
What they suffered materially has helped both of them to see how things can change so quickly. But yet, hold their faith, and their faith has been strengthened by the reaction of the church, not only here, but throughout the United States. And that has caused them for their faith to be stronger. Are they still a little suffering from it? Of course. But at the same time, they see how the brethren react. And that just really encourages them to.
Right, and that's it's not good what they went through, but I guarantee you they're going to be stronger people, stronger Christians, and everything because of it. And we're not saying we want to go through those type of things, but we all have our different things that we go through in this life. Nobody is free from anything. Things are going to happen, and it just depends on how we decide to do it. Before you, Mom, it's kind of like what Tammy said. It depends on how we react to the trials and tribulations. And that's really what it comes down to. How do you react to things? And you know, when someone gives you bad news, you get angry and mad at them because they told you about it? And they're like, whoa, I'm just a deliverer. It wasn't me. And you know, you ever heard people say that? And we understand that. So that is really important. Mom, go ahead.
An example of using something that happened that was bad like this, the fire, but making something good. One of the people who sent money for Nikki and David had just had their house burned to the ground and
Wow.
lost everything.
Wow.
But they sent a good.
And what they said in there to go along with that was, we were blessed by brethren, and now we have the opportunity from our own experience to help here. And that's a lot of times we recognize when we experience something like that, that maybe that is something God has, or not God has taken place, but it has taken place, and grow from it and use that to help somebody else who may be experiencing the same thing.
That's exactly, you know, I've always said that, and that's where we have to really think about, you know, how often do you, if you go through something, you ask, you know, why am I going through this? Why is it like this? And then you see later, God, you know, it's not that God's making it happen to you, but it's that God is allowing you to make a choice now how you're going to handle it. And that's it, or are we going to turn around and maybe help somebody out with what they're dealing with, the same thing that we went through? And if someone does that, that shows maturity, that shows growth. And that's where we're at with those things. And God, you know, God knows what we need to grow in. God knows what we need maturity in. And I've had some people, and a person didn't like it when I said this to them, they said, I don't understand why I struggle with money, why it's so hard, why I've asked God to, you know, take care of me, give me some more money, this and that, so on, and it just doesn't happen. And I said I could probably tell you the answer to that. And they're like, really? I said, good, maybe you could fix it. And I said, well, first of all, it's your response, what you just talking to me about. I said, God probably knows you can't handle it. And they go, hold on a minute. And I go, what I mean by that, it's true. I said, God knows it. God knows what will happen. You get that. You may end up worshiping that money, that in a sense, and not God. And I've actually seen that happen to people, you know, and vice versa, where people understood, you know, I know why this isn't happening to me, that I want it to happen because I won't handle it properly. And that's what we see. And so it's like that with everything, not just money, but all different things. And we see that as we go through life. Any other questions or comments before we move on? All right, so as we see this, here's the first step to turning trials into triumph. And this is what we just read. And well, excuse me, let me read this one. I forgot about these two. We see the attitude of Christians. Let's look what Peter talks about in two areas. If someone go and read this one for us, and then we'll move on to the next one. 1 Peter chapter 4, I think it was 6 through 7.
In this you greatly rejoice, though you for a little while. If need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Thank you, brother. So as we see this here, that wasn't so small. Because I knew it because I was trying to see it on the TV. I was like, okay, what does that say there? So as you see this here, here's what it is. you think about, precious metals, you think about gold, and notice how it says right in that perishes through it, though it is tested by fire. When you melt gold, what are you melting out?
All the sludge.
All the sludge, impurities, and you're left with gold, and that's it. And that's kind of what he's getting at with our life. Sometimes that trials does that. It gets rid of the sludge. It gets rid of the impurities, and we get to move forward to being stronger. And that's what we have this other one like this in 1 Peter chapter 4. That's a lot bigger. Verses 12 through 14. If someone would read that for us, please.
Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is glorified.
Thank you. So, when we see these words, rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. So, you think about what Jesus went through. A lot of times when we really think about what Christ went through, we think of the cross. We think of, the time before the cross. There's so much more than that. Think about Jesus being here on this earth, knowing what he gave up to grow up here on this earth, knowing that when he started into his mission, into his teaching and preaching to people, of those that wouldn't have anything to do with him, that didn't like him, that were calling him names, called him a blasphemer. Could you imagine calling God a blasphemer? Really think, would you ever think about calling God a blasphemer? We'd be like, no way. And that's what was happening. And then, even those closest to him, we see they did what? And towards the end, what did we see the disciples do who would become apostles? They left him. He felt alone. And so we see those things that he goes through. So all those sufferings that we think Jesus went through, really, we go through them too. And especially as Christians. And he says, rejoice in those. And so there's where we see that first step to turning triumph, into glory we see there. And that is to immediately thank God and adopt a joyful attitude. And I will admit, we all probably will. That's a hard thing to do, isn't it? When we're under trials. That's a difficult thing to do. But this is what it is. Paul even saying, thank you for counting me worthy enough to stand up through these trials. To be burdened by, these trials to be on top of me. And we're thinking like, wow. And of course, that we say it only is spiritual, but it wasn't only that. Remember, Paul did a lot of physical stuff. He was in jail. We know the others were in prison. Different things happened to them. They were just, went without, not that they went starving or anything, but they did go without sometimes shelter, and things were just difficult. They were tough, but God always got them through it when they had that joyful attitude. And you ask yourself, in the trials you've been through, think about when it was harder. Was it harder when you were upset, when you were mad, when you were bitter, and just angry that you were going through it? Or did it actually seem to get better when you're like, okay, God, I understand this is happening. I don't know why, but I'm going to work through it, and I'm going to keep you at the forefront while I get through it. And it seems like you move through that, and you think about it, and it allows you to grow. And so we may ask, is it possible really to rejoice in the midst of trials? Well, the second imperative in verse 3, the second area there, the second quality we would say, actually tells us this. And this is what we read here. It states this: knowing that the testing of your faith produces what? Patience. So he's saying these trials are testing. And it's a testing of our faith. And we look through the Bible. There are many people in the Bible, I'm sure, that we look up to. But even those same people we look up to, guess what? They failed a lot of tests. They failed a lot of trials. And they did. But when they failed it and they look back at it, they're like, okay, I could have done this better. And they learned to go through and deal with it and move forward. Brother Clifford.
I don't know about everybody else, but when I turned my trials over to God, but the flesh in me and the human in me still wants to go back and try to handle it.
Yeah.
Once I turn it over, the trials, I'm supposed to just let go and let God handle it. But, being the human side of me, I still won't stick my nose in it and trying to handle it and take care of it, but I've turned it over to him. And, that's the mistake I make, as being a fleshly human.
I'm sure we could all say that's happened to us and have a ton of time. I mean, you know, I think what happens is we pray to God, we go, God, I'm going to turn this over to you, let it go. And we have it kind of in our mind the way it's supposed to go.
Yeah.
And the way we want it to go. And it doesn't happen that way. We're like, God, I've got to help you here because you're not doing it like I want it to be done. And God knows, you know, He knows what we need. He knows how fast it needs to move. He knows how slow it needs to move. He knows where we need to be. And sometimes those things happen to where we don't have to deal with something else down the road. That's what's remarkable about it that we see. Brother Doug, do you have a comment?
Well, if you look at the way most of the New Testament is, the parts that Paul wrote, he was a bad guy up until Christ spoke to him. And then he was the same from then until we don't actually know what happened to him, but until he died. Because even when he was in prison, he said he was okay in whatever situation he was in. And so he was down and out because part of it was house arrest, part of it was in prison.
Right.
And the prisons were not very good then. And we turn over stuff to God, and some of our trials, we get over them, and then we kind of slip back into the same thing, whereas Paul didn't. Paul stayed the same from the time he was converted on up until he died.
That's exactly right.
Maybe we should be more like Paul.
And that's true. And, that's where Paul, even when he said about, I'm going through these sufferings, you do the same also. Part of that wasn't that he's saying, I want you to experience these. He goes, but pray with me, pray for me, keep me in your prayers. And Paul said that constantly while he was going through those things. Paul knew God was listening to him, but at the same time, and the same thing with us, if you pray to God, you're like, okay, you're expecting God to hear you. Would you want other people to pray for you also? Of course we would. And that shows God that we are not only relying on Him, but we're relying on what He talks about, the brotherhood, and relying on us to help us all get through this. And so this is the part of the second part, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. And when we think about that, this is where it's at. The right knowledge concerning the value of trials makes it possible to have a joyful attitude. This is where it comes down to. We have to have knowledge of God. We have to have knowledge of Jesus. We have to have knowledge of the other, disciples and apostles, the writers, what they went through during the 1st and 2nd century. We need to have this knowledge of the Old Testament and how they dealt with things. And I believe when we see that, it allows us to understand what it means by having joy. It allows us to understand how we can get through these things. Are we to understand that trials test our faith? Without a doubt, we're to understand that. But faith tested can bring out, guess what? Do you think the worst in us or the best in us? Faith tested. It's going to bring out the best in us. It really, and here it is. That doesn't mean you're always going to pass the test. You're going to be in a joyful attitude to get through it. But if we do the things that we know about, that we read about in the Bible, it will make us better. It will make us better. And it'll allow us to deal with other things. You may be dealing with a small trial to be able to handle a bigger one that's going to come down the road. Or you may be dealing with a big one, and when a little one comes, guess what? It's just like, just walk right on through it. I mean, and that's what we see. And so that's what we find these things. That's why Peter talked about that. We mentioned a moment ago. We read it. I'm not going to read it again. But about about that fire and the gold and understanding how it tests that fire and may be found to praise Him, and to honor and glory God, in all that we're going through and what we're dealing with. Dad, go ahead.
I've used this illustration before. It's about the silversmith refining in Ezekiel 22:18. The story kind of goes, I'm going to make it real quick, that ladies were having a study and they were wondering about why he sits there watching this. And so she went and talked with him, and he's sitting there telling her while he's working and looking, And he said, you have to be very careful because you can overdo the silver and ruin it. And she said, well, how do you know when it's ready? He said, well, I watch it, I pull it out, and I look at it, I watch it, pull it out, look at it, and when I can see my reflection in that silver, I know it's done. And that's the way God is with us. He refines us. Then when he sees that reflection, or of us like him, then it has manifested itself for us.
That's a great point. And, it does what it's supposed to do for us. It's exactly right. And just amazing. When we look at this, it takes, as you're saying, pull it out, check it, pull it out, check it backward. And it's kind of like that in life. We have to train ourselves to understand how to get through those trials. And I've said this before, Paul was always talking a lot about running. He talked about that and training. And I think it's because it's such an easy thing to understand. And I know as when I was in high school as an athlete in track, and I've said this before, I was a sprinter. And the coach would be like, all right, we're going to go out and run around the track 8 times. We're going to do 2 miles. And I'm like, I am not doing that. And he's like, well, what do you mean you're not doing that? I said, I'm a sprinter. I don't need to run 2 miles. That's just not what I do. And, and the other sprinters were kind of the same way. And he's like, I don't care what you think you're going to do. You're going to do it if you want to be on the team. And I'm like, why? What is it going to do for me? I said, I'll just run a bunch of hundreds real quick. And I said, that'll strengthen me. He goes, no, it's not going to do the same. And I'm like, okay, so you run that, and what it does, you think about it, it makes your legs stronger, your muscles more developed, your lungs get a little bigger, and next thing you know, you're running in a say 100 meter, actually back then it was 100 yards, and you're running that, and you look at it and you're like, okay, I didn't want to shave off a little bit of time, and say you shave off 1/10 of a second. Now to somebody says that doesn't sound like nothing. That is a lot when you're talking about sprinting. And and you've worked all this, and it's like nothing's happening. I haven't shaved any time off. And then the next thing you know, you run 100 and you're like, whoa, I just shaved a 10th off. Well, what was that? Because I thought about it? No, it was because of that training. It was to get me there. Same thing works with our spiritual life. It doesn't come immediately. It doesn't come, in a day or two. It takes time. And that's why I believe that these trials that we go through from time to time are building us up to handle any others down the road. And the more we get. And so with this understanding, we can have joy in the trials because we know that testing works for us, not against us. And that's how we look at it. Because a lot of times I think we'll look at the side where, why is this happening to me, God? What's going on? And we go against it. And then we look back at it and we go, okay, I don't know what this is, why this happened this way, but I know God can get me through this. And like Brother Clifford said, was, turn it over to God, let God do it, but it is true. A lot of times we want to go like, I want to grab some of that, God. I want to work on it too. And he's like, let go. Let go. That old saying was really big in the 70s, let go and let God. And when we do that, and if you've done that, you've probably seen how it worked, how it did work. And when I say relinquish everything, I mean we totally relinquish it to God. And he gets through it. We as human beings say, we want to control things. I'm driving down the road, when we go traveling anywhere, I don't like sitting in the passenger seat. I just don't do it. I like being in control of that steering wheel. Because I found if I did it, there's a hole in the bottom of the floorboard by the time wherever we're going. They're screaming on it, hitting the brake, and there's nothing there. And it's not I want to be a control freak, but it's where I'd rather be at. And when we do that a lot of times in our regular everyday life for trials, doesn't it? When we've told God, take care of this, and then we go, well, I'll grab this part, you do the rest. And he's like, no, you need to let it go. And we do that, and how great that is. Dad, go ahead.
You're absolutely right about like running the race. That's what Paul said. And there's no shortcuts.
Nope.
You can't run a course and cut across the field and go to the finish line. You have to run the whole course. And that's what Paul said. I have fought a good fight, and I've finished my course. I've run my race. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. 2 Timothy. And that's so true. We can look at Paul's example and the apostles and what they went through. And he said, for this light affliction, he called everything that happened to him a light affliction. It pales in comparison to what we have waiting for us eternally.
Right.
And that's what we have to look to.
Right.
That we can get through these things, and God will take care of us. He will never leave our side as long as we are faithful to Him.
That's exactly right. You know, that's where that knowledge we were saying, that knowledge comes from. It's just like, and I love how you said about taking a shortcut. You know, we you know, if we don't get knowledge from it and learn from it, we're not going to know how to deal with it the next time. I mean, how many of you have ever heard of Cliff Notes? Anybody heard of those? You know the old Cliff Notes? And Cliff Notes were written to help your short-term memory. They weren't written to help you with your long-term memory. And I remember going in high school, I was like, oh, I don't want to study for this test. I'm just going to get some Cliff Notes. I don't want to read this whole book, you know, whatever. And you get it, and you're like, bam, you get it done, and you do halfway decent on the test, and you're done with it. But then like 2 or 3 weeks later, guess what you've forgotten? You don't remember anything about it. Then you get the final, and guess what's on the final? A lot of that stuff that was in your Cliff Notes that you don't have a clue about anymore. And because you tried to take a shortcut. There it is. And, you know, that knowledge, we have to actually study it and learn it to grow from it. And it works the same way in our spiritual and physical life when we deal with trials. That's what he's saying. In fact, testing, this is what we say in this verse here. Look how I said, testing works for us, not against us. So we'll go and read this for us, please. 2 Corinthians 4:17.
For our light affection, which is but for a moment, working for us for a far more exciting and eternal weight of glory.
Thank you. So we see this, you know, it says the light affliction, which is but for a moment. Sometimes those moments can feel long, can't they? Everybody agree with that? Sometimes those moments can feel long. But notice what he says here. It works for us a far more exceeding eternal weight of glory. In other words, it teaches us to rely on God. You know, if everything was perfect in this life, just let me say this. If you had a great day every day, and what I mean by no problems, no trials, no tribulations, nothing at all, would you really think about heaven? You think you would? I mean, no. I mean, we think about heaven because we know there's somewhere better than this. We know there's something far better than this, a glory. And if things are always, you know, like it's like why would we want to, we're like, I want to be here. I want to stay here. This is what it's all about. And we see that. And that's, excuse me, why we see sometimes those trials rightly used, will help us mature. And will help us strengthen our maturity. Which brings us to the next point before we get ready to close. And notice this, what it says. And so it says, you know, the right knowledge concerning the value of trials makes it possible to have the joyful attitude. Specifically, faith tested produces patience. So that's what he says. He goes, faith. Now here's what's interesting. We were talking a moment ago about the worldly and spiritual. Here he's specifically saying, Paul's saying, look, your faith, when your faith in God, your faith in Christ is tested, you know, it will produce patience. But it's interesting the way Paul talks even farther than Romans 5 that we're going to see here in just a moment. It's even our faith in each other. And, you know, and that's what we see. Not that I should put my faith to get me to heaven in another person, because people are you know, going to make mistakes and problems and sin just like all of us will. And we see that. But there are times when we want to put faith in others. We want to do that. And when that's tested, it will also produce patience. That's why he says this, Romans 5, 3, and 4. We'll close with this verse. Someone go ahead and read this for us, please.
And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope.
Thank you. When we read this earlier, notice I stopped at verse 3. We just read the perseverance, didn't we? Then you read a little further, and perseverance, character, and character does what? Brings hope. He's saying all these you have to deal with tribulation, and Paul also references it back to trials also. And we see this. And this is the whole thing. It produces something for us. It's not just there to make you upset. It's not that there just to hurt us. It's not there to just say, I'm having a horrible day. It's going to produce something. We need to make a choice from the knowledge of God what we're going to allow it to produce. And that's the thing. If we do it properly, it's going to get right there at the end of that character. It's going to produce hope in us. Hope of God, hope of understanding what he's part of, and hope of where we're going to be one day, and a hope of why we're actually dealing with what we're dealing with. And that's what patience is. Next week, we'll look at what patience means. And I'll tell you, it's a hupomone, or hupomone in the Greek, I think it's right, hupomone, yeah, that's it. And it's basically two words that mean one thing. And remember what I kept saying about being under that pressure of patience, and that's really what patience is. And we'll talk more about that, Dad, before we close.
This last thought here of hope. It's not a hope like, well, it's something going to happen. This is an absolute assurance
Right.
that when we go through these things, we have assurance that God cares about us, and we have that hope, that expectation with desire for heaven.
That's exactly right. That's why we see there at the end of 1 Corinthians 13 where it says faith, hope, and love. That's an assured hope. It's exactly right. And it's the same thing here. And when we have that, when that's come to us, I always say when we have that kind of hope, it's like, devil, look out, because I'm going to run right over you. I mean, and that's what it is, because God's going to get me through it. And we see that, the importance with it. So we'll go ahead and close there unless anybody else has a comment before we close. Anybody? No? All right, we're going to close there and get back to this next week. Thank you.